Good day and welcome to this training video. My name is Leon and I'm going to be taking you through a detailed guide of the substantive sampling template, specifically the automated Pastel sampling. Now I have already created a RAC client and I've done a fair amount of setup already. This template will not work if you don't first go through the planning process. There is various information that it does pull through, such as your trial balance, components, things like that. However, now that those items have been done, starting up the template, you can just go into your audit programs, go to section 80, and there will be your Pastel automated template, 80.05. And let's open that up. Now, importantly, once this document has opened up, the first thing to do is actually not to insert anything on this document, but basically to go and save this template somewhere within your file. If you go and make changes to the template itself, the next sample you try and draw within RAC is going to have all the information of your first sample. So what we do is go to the Actions tab and go and give it a file name. So in this case, let's go and call it 51.52, and it is my expenses and cost of sales sample. All right, go to Audit Programs, click on Audit Programs, and this will now save this as 51.52 within my audit programs. The important thing is give it a reference, give it a space, and then you can give it a name, and that will allow you to hyperlink, and as in this case you'll see it also appears in the correct place in my audit programs menu. All right, now you are ready to proceed. Action 1 on this document actually is in the guidance sheet of the workbook. And what it's asking here is for you to determine what components are going to be selected or what components are included in the procedure. Now remember, in your audit program, you would have gone and specified, I'm going to do sampling, these are the assertions I'm going to cover, and these are the components. So this needs to reflect what you've documented in your audit program. You can't haphazardly go and select components. So in this case, I've designed a procedure to test cost of sales and expenses with one sample because they both operate within the creditor cycle. They're probably using a periodic inventory system, so all their purchases go straight into the cost of sales account, and every month there's just a journal to adjust their inventory balance. So there I have selected my two components, and that is all that you need to do on the guidance sheet. The next thing we need to do is go and specify the appropriate materiality that we're going to be using. Now, Action 2 gives us a number of drop-downs, and if you click simply there, are you using planning or revised materiality? So if you have used 80.05, which is the revised materiality calculation, you can specify at this point that that is the materiality that I'm using. The importance of this selection is that what we're trying to prevent is if you later need to redo a sample, maybe you need to now do it on revised rather than planning, there is some separation. So let's go and select planning, and also you can then select an appropriate indicator. Now in this file, what I've done just for demonstration purposes is I have given total assets a different materiality, and you'll see as soon as I change that, it adjusts the materiality figure for me. And this is the importance of doing the client setup and the planning correctly before you get to this document. Otherwise, you're going to sit with R1 there, and that's not going to give you an appropriate sample. So you need to actually go and document your materiality in the planning phase of the audit first. Action 3 is now asking me to confirm what assertions I'm going to be testing. Now, once again, this actually falls back to your audit program. There you would have specified on your audit program what assertions you're going to test. Now, in this case, let's go and say we are testing occurrence, valuation accuracy, and classification and understandability. Now please be very careful. Completeness and occurrence generally are not two assertions that you can test with a single sample. You need to go and test completeness separately. So please be careful when designing procedures that you're not testing completeness and occurrence at the same time. You can't do that from a sample. Okay, as soon as you have specified assertions for cost of sales, it will automatically carry those over to the other components because generally you're going to be doing the same assertions for all the components that you've included. Now, The next thing it does is it goes through all the items that you've said yes to, and it goes and identifies what's the highest level of assurance required, and this comes from our audit plan, for any of the assertions that I've selected. And in this case, it goes and finds that it is moderate. Now, once again, when designing your audit program, you would have specified a level of assurance in your audit program. So that is the final decision that you make. So you don't have to select moderate because it is selected moderate. Maybe your procedures only require low because you're doing tests or controls that are going to deal with a higher level of risk on the occurrence in this case. But ultimately, this is the value that needs to agree to your audit program. Once we've done that, you'll see that there's an orange line that pops in here, and it says, please insert the detailed ledger into the Pastel sheet and evaluate the population on the population check sheet before continuing. So at this point, we now stop moving from left to right, and we actually skip over and go from right to left. Let's go to the Pastel sheet. Alright, so here is my Pastel sheet, and I now need to go and import a raw Pastel GL. And I have one prepared. Here it is, and I'm taking everything from account 2000 all the way to about 4000. I've added a few extra. There are one or two things I want to just discuss, but you'll see this is unedited. This is exactly a GL dump from Pastel. I just copy it there, and the preference is to now go and do paste special. I right click there and go and paste the values. Alright, that keeps the formatting nice. You get the nice green background. Now, as soon as I've done that, you'll see there was a bit of a delay. There are in excess of 100,000 calculations that have just run, and it now tells me there is an error, material item #num. Alright, the reason for this error is if I have a look at the date column here in Pastel, Pastel inserts a little tick in front of the date. It forces the date to actually be a text cell when you export from Pastel. Now, part of the reason for that is to try and keep formatting consistent when exporting from Pastel. There are issues with dates sometimes in Excel. However, this causes some problem for us because that date is not a date, it is a text. So what we have done is, depending on the settings of your Pastel in your computer, you need to go and specify for me what the date format is. So in this case, you'll see quite easily it's day / month / year. So just go and select the appropriate layout with that drop-down list, and it'll take a couple of seconds as it's running through the calculations, and now the error is gone. Okay. Now we need to go and decide what sampling method we are going to be using. Now we have included a haphazard, a systematic, and a monetary unit option. However, the preference is monetary unit. Let me go through them all briefly with you, and then I'll explain why. Firstly, haphazard is exactly what it is. It is completely random. There is a random number generated for every single line within this workbook, and based on that random number, a random selection of items will be selected. Okay, so that is really, there's a lot of randomness that goes into it. If you're looking for a random sample, that's the most random you're going to get. There's no way that you can influence the result. It is just going to be purely random. The second one, systematic. What it then does is it says I have 100 transactions, I need a sample of 10. So every 10 transactions, I need to select one. So it doesn't look at the rand value, it just simply goes and picks items that can be sampled, and every nth item based on your sample size will be selected. Monetary unit then, instead, it's similar to systematic, except that every 1 rand is now a sampling item. So instead of looking for every nth item, it looks for every nth rand. Now, monetary unit is specifically discussed and mentioned in the IFAC guide for audits of small and medium-sized entities. So we prefer that. That for us is probably one of the better ones to use, and it has got a very good statistical base. And we're using the formulas directly from that IFAC guide, so we're pretty confident with that monetary unit. The next question here is asking what items need to be sampled. And this is a very important decision to be making. It's asking me, do I want to select debit items, credit items, or both? Now Pastel's GL puts the debits in this column, the credits in this column, and it has a running balance. Now I don't actually use the running balance in this template. I just have a look at what's there and what's there, work out whether it's a debit or credit amount, and then we draw our sample from that. Generally, both is actually quite a dangerous selection to make because credit items don't normally form part of your test for the occurrence of line items in a general ledger. You might need to go and test debits and credits separately. So in other words, you do a procedure to test your sales, for instance. You will do one procedure for sales, a different procedure for the returns. So just be careful about using both. The areas that I would generally use it is if I'm sampling something like my debtors ledger, my debtors age analysis. Even if a debtor has a credit balance, I still want to review that debtor for existence, whatever the case might be. There I would use both, but otherwise you can go and select, am I selecting the debits or the credits out of this general ledger? Just for this demonstration, I'm going to use both, just to show you some of the key elements that come out, and we'll take it from there. All right, now what I've done when I pulled in this GL is I didn't go and pick and choose exactly the GL accounts that I wanted to select from. There are some GL accounts here that we don't need. So I've generally gone and in training and in other videos I've said go and put the whole general ledger in. It's fine, you can do that. Just be aware the more line items you copy in, the longer it's going to take to do calculations, and the document can get quite slow. So what I've done is I haven't gone from account 1000 to 9000, I've just gone from 2000 to 4000 in this GL. So just go and select the chunk that is most appropriate, especially if you do have a very long GL. The step now is, however, to go to my population check sheet, and it's going to go and verify that what I have in my GL is actually in agreement with what is on my trial balance. So let's go and have a look at the population check sheet. Now immediately you'll see there is the account number, that's the account name from my trial balance, the opening and closing balances in accordance with my working trial balance, and this is the balance in population. And you can see that it's telling me that it is matching. Just to prove that it will pick up an error, if I go and delete one item there, so in other words, delete the row, or whatever the case might be, and I go back to my population check, immediately it's telling me there is no longer a match between either the opening or closing balance or the balance in the population. So it's first going to go and check, does this equal opening? Then it tells me opening, or does it equal closing? It'll tell me closing, or in this case, no, it doesn't match. If you have a lot of no's, that could be a potential problem, because then the population that you're drawing from in your general ledger does not agree to your trial balance. So it's not a valid population to be using. However, having said that, and I just want to return that line item back so that the population check works again, if I scroll down, you will see when I get to account 5000, and these are some extra ones that I pulled in, I'm getting a no. It does not match. Now, the problem with this population check and balance sheet accounts, and please I want to specify this is for balance sheet accounts only. Income statement accounts, this document should work. The problem here is that what sits in my general ledger is a movement, not the opening and closing balances. So this system is going and finding the movement in my general ledger. So the movement in the share capital for the year was 0, but my opening and closing balances were unmoved. Okay, so in this case, you'd be looking at, does that movement between those two items agree to the balance in population? Generally, if we are testing balance sheet accounts, we can't really sample from the general ledger unless you are doing something like additions for PPE. What you should be doing is getting a listing. So if you are testing trade debtors, don't put the debtors ledger in here to make sampling. To make a sample, you need to put the age analysis in, and that we'll use the other sampling template for, and I'll show that in a different video. For now, we are focusing on income statement items and that's what we will be testing in Pastel. So if you do come across balance sheet items that have this error, you can ignore it because we're not going to be sampling from those at this point in time in general. Okay. In a case where you are testing additions and you've pulled in your asset cost accounts, then just go and make a note. There is a procedure, and I'll show you. Make a note how you've tested for the completeness of your population. This is just to go and make sure everything is all right in as much detail as we can. All right. I can now also, if I go to my population check, the next step is to go and decide what I am going to include. So this is a fairly long trial balance, so there's going to be a lot of yeses to type in here, but this is to go and select which items I'm actually going to sample from. As we go through, you'll see I get to 2100. Those are inventory adjustments. I'm not going to sample inventory adjustments. All right, I'm looking for purchases. Purchase variance as well is going to be a journal, and I'll test that elsewhere. We get to direct costs. I can include those in my sample. When I get to wages, no, I'll test wages under payroll costs. Other income, definitely not. Now we get to some expense items, my accounting fees, advertising, admin fee, bank charges. I've said yes here to bad debts. Bad debts I will go and test elsewhere. I won't do it with sampling. Okay, let's go through quickly. Other things to skip: depreciation, donations, finance charges we can skip, forex expenses in or out depending on the nature. Insurance is in, interest is out. We can include leasing charges, but I won't include share capital. If I now go back to my Pastel sheet, you'll see that it's now in this cell, or in this column, sampleable items. Yes, these are sampleable. In other words, they are either debit or credit, because it's both. Just to show you, if I change that to debit, what it'll do is this line item, which has now got a credit balance, will change to no, that is not sampleable, because it's not a debit amount. Okay, so there's a lot of logic, a lot of calculations going on, so just be patient while it recalculates. Now what I can also go and do is I can specify that these two items, for whatever reason, I specifically want to test. So there could be one GL account that there are 5 items and you just want to test them, or you've noted in reviewing the general ledger there are some unusual items. You can go and specify them as key items, and those will then automatically be included in your sample. All right, so I've done my Pastel sheet, I've done the population check, I'm happy with the results. If you do sit with something like this and you'd rather clean it up, what you can go and do is go and delete those accounts from this sheet. Okay, we don't need 5,000 in there. It's not going to be part of my population, so that when I go back to my population check sheet, those items are no longer going to show. All right, I've done those 2 sheets. I go back to my sample size calc sheet now. Okay, so I can move beyond this little orange line. Action 4 is going and determining basically what is my population, what am I going to see on my lead schedule. It's just giving me some statistics on the population. Now what you'll see, the population amount, the rand value to be sampled, is sitting at 108 million. However, the total population amount as per the lead schedule should only be 97 million. The reason for the difference in these two amounts, and if you look at your lead sheet, what you should be linking to on your lead sheet is this 97 million. But my population is 108 million because what I've done is I've gone and looked at the absolute value of the items in your population that I can sample from. So if it's a credit, I've added it to the debits. I haven't subtracted it from the debits. It's not a net amount, it is a gross amount, because that is what I'm going to sample from. If you only select debits, let's go here and change that to debit items only, and I go back to my sample size calc. You'll see the value has changed, but it is still different from the 97. The reason for this is all the debit amounts in my population come to 103. But again, in net, in terms of my trial balance, the credits would come off that. So there's close to about 6 million rands worth of credit items sitting in my population. So if I go back to Pastel sheet, go back to both, it'll send my sample size population, or the population value now to 108 million, and again it's added that 6 odd million credit items as a absolute value. All right, in total, there are 3,769 line items that can be sampled from, and here I would now need to go and describe how the completeness of the population was considered. Now, if this population check sheet worked as it did in my case, there is your answer. All right, refer to the population check sheet. All items in the population are agreeing with the trial balance. However, if you're doing some other sampling, you might need to go and specify how exactly you have worked out exactly that your population is complete. Okay, action 5. Identify all individual transactions in the population that are equal or above to performance materiality. Now, this has been done for you. Remember that 900,000 materiality, that's my performance materiality, just as a point of reference. And there are 2 items above 900,000. It has automatically selected those 2 items, and the total value of the 2 items together comes to 1.8 million. Then in action 6, I'm looking at key items. I specify 2 key items. There is their value. And now I am left with a remaining population of 106 million. That's just literally taking the 108 minus the 1.8 minus the 53,000, and that gives me 106 million. There are 3,765 line items left. Again, 3,769 minus 2 minus 2. And now I need to describe what type of sampling will be used. I have 2 options. There are 2 tables built into the RAC sampling. There is a percentage of population and based on performance materiality. Now this has an effect on how the sample size is calculated. Basically, percentage of population, that says 10%, 20%, 30% of the population. That is your sample size. It is as simple as that. However, once again, referring back to the RFAC guide uses this based on performance materiality, and that is our preferred method to be used. All right, based on performance materiality. And I now need to go and insert a random decimal. Now, you can use Excel formulas to do this. If you type equal to rand, open and close brackets, press enter, it inserts a random value between 0 and 1. However, don't leave the formula there. Go and copy and value paste so that you now have that decimal value in there, and you now have a random decimal number in. Okay, it's important to change that random decimal for every single sample that you select. However, if you leave the formula in there, every time you change something within the workbook, it changes the random number, and then you will get a new sample, which can be a little frustrating. Okay, has the entity had an audit qualification in the last 5 years? And is the overall control environment effective in the entity? The reason for these 2 questions is built within our sampling methodology is the option to use a suggested maximum sample size rather than the full sample size calculated. However, we are looking at lower risk clients where we will allow this maximum to be used. So we're looking for an audit qualification in the last 5 years. We don't want one, so no. And is the overall control environment effective in the entity? We're looking for a yes before we will allow the suggested maximum sample sizes. All right. And then the PIS score, this should be calculated. Once again, if you have inserted the values correctly in the setup, you won't need to change anything. But if you do need to use the drop down to adjust that, that again adjusts the maximum. Just various ways that we look at how we can calculate a reliable and valid maximum for your sample size. And we now get to the actual calculation of the sample size. So we've said we're testing with low to moderate. This R of 1.6 comes pretty much out of the RFAC guide, and we can go through the detail of those calculations if necessary, but otherwise look at our sampling methodology documentation. And then the calculation of the sample size, it is actually specifying 190.14 items need to be selected. Generally, you'd round that up, 191. You can't select part of an item. You have to round it up. But it is telling me that my suggested maximum is 40. Okay. Once again, it's based on various factors. but you don't. It's not prescriptive. You don't have to use that. We are saying here in the last cell, what is my sample size? I can't go and select 35. Okay, it's going to give me an error. Why? Because that's less than the suggested maximum, and it is less than the calculated sample size. It has to be summing between those two items. So let's go and say, based on judgment, I selected 50, and then you can go and document your reasoning in the cell. Please give good reasoning and explain why you are using a specific sample size. All right. Action 8 is just going and what I said earlier about completeness and occurrence. It's giving you a reminder that you might need to look at separate samples based on your selections, but otherwise there's not too much that you need to worry about filling in there if, as in this case, you are not trying to test occurrence and completeness. Okay, so now I've got my sample size of 50. I move over to the procedure detail sheet. Now the reason for this workbook is when we get to our actual workbook, we don't want to have a column with a whole detailed long description in. That's going to make my workbook look a little oversized. So what we all want to do is we want to say, well, these are the procedures A, B, C, and this workbook is now actually telling you what is A, what is B, what is C. So what we would do is document. Let me just take off my caps lock. All right, and once I've documented something, it goes and gives me an A. All right, now the procedures that you are putting in here are probably going to come from your audit program. So don't go and design new procedures here. Your audit program should be specifying how you are addressing these various assertions that you've selected. Okay, in this case I'm not going to go through too much detail. I'm just going to document 3 items. You can document multiple if necessary, but the point here is go and put procedures in for all the assertions. Okay, once I've done the procedure detail, I can go over to my sample testing workbook. And what will be here now, minimizing that, is nice and easy. Here are my material items. They're both over 900,000. There are my key items, as I've selected from my Pastel population sheet. And here are the remaining 50 items that I need to go and test. And the system has now gone and pulled in all the details from that sheet, from the GL that you've inputted, and inserted it here. Here is your working paper to go and do your testing. So what we've done, if I scroll a little bit to the right, we've got 3 columns blank where you can go and document information. So this could be, for instance, if you want to capture invoice number, supplier name, whatever other details that you want your clerks to go and get when you are performing the test. And you can go and document this information. And here is my ABC. So it's just telling me for the occurrence assertion we're doing A, refer back to procedure detail. What am I doing? ABC. That will help. You don't want that huge column here with a long detailed description of what you're actually doing. Just the ABC works quite easily. All right, you'd need to go and do this for all items, but to make life a little bit easier again, we've got a little drop down. So you can go and just use the drop down tick, or you can use Control-C, Control-V, or you can go and insert any of your own items that you want to. If you need to make a note, there's in the drop down a 1 to 20 available. Scroll down to the bottom of the workbook. Here is my legend. Go and put in a 1, and I can explain whatever you need to for that item. Fix my spelling. Or you can go and insert your own values. This just goes 1 to 20. You can go and use, if you prefer, percentage, and whatever the case might be. So go and put in your notes, making the document as complete as possible. What we further do from here, action 10, is we start looking at misstatements. If you are identifying any misstatements in this population. So here I would go and document a RAND value. If I find any errors, let's go and say 8,000. All right. Now, I'm going to put an 8,000 in that cell and 9,500 credit here. Just read what's sitting in this heading. The RAND value of error, if any, and express credit to the primary component as a negative. So if you find that this amount is overstated. It's a debit balance. It is overstated by 9,500 Rand. I need to go and credit expenses. That's why I put a credit in here. Expenses are is my primary component. Your other component we will document later. Okay, is this a systematic or an isolated item? A systematic error is one that you expect to find recurring in the system based on a weakness in the control, whatever the case might be. An isolated error is when something has really just happened once. So you've only purchased from the supplier once and you find out that their calculators don't work and they calculated the VAT incorrectly. That would be isolated. Systematic is something that you expect could recur. Systematic items get extrapolated. Isolated items don't. Now, is this a disagreement or a limitation adjustment? The difference here in a disagreement adjustment is where you find a difference and you know that I need to debit expenses, credit, whatever it might be, trade payables, you know what the issue is, and you're going to be able to draw up a journal. A limitation disagreement comes where you don't know what the other leg of the transaction is. And for further information, please go and have a look at the ISAs, just in terms of the definition of the two. Generally, you're probably going to be dealing with a disagreement adjustment when you're dealing with a sample, except where the client is unable to, for instance, give you some supporting documents or is unable to give you any further information to allow you to decide what the adjustment needs to be. I'm going to make both of these disagreement adjustments. And now we need to go and document the primary component. The primary component is just going to be one of the two, in this case, components that I've selected. This is what the test is. That's why I say that's a credit to other expenses, but a debit to cost of sales. And now I can go and document the other component being affected. Let's go, in this case, say it was inventory, and in this case, say it was trade and other payables. Okay, just simply use the drop down and that links it to the appropriate component. Once you've done this for all your items, this errors and extrapolation sheet will now go and give you details of, here is my disagreement, cost of sales, other expenses, inventory, trade and other payables. This is the known, this is the extrapolated portion, and that is the total error that you have uncovered. Now in this case, 900,000 was my materiality for this test, so these would probably go and just be transferred to my overs and unders schedule, and I won't need the client to pass any journals. However, let's just go and say, for instance, this was 800,000. Go to my errors and extrapolation. I'm now sitting with a 9.6 million, and at this point I would probably say that, you know what, this the sample has probably failed. You've probably not gotten sufficient appropriate audit evidence on the cost of sales and inventory items. So there you would go and extend your sample, add additional items. At this stage the template doesn't cover that, but in future hopefully it will. But basically you either need to just dump the procedure, go and do something else, or you're going to need to qualify this audit because there is a very material error sitting in your cost of sales and inventory. Okay, so that is a detailed view of the sampling template for Pastel Automated Sampling. I trust this is helpful, and I would highly recommend watching this while you're doing one or two of your samples, just to make sure that you do follow and understand the concepts. Otherwise, please hop onto remote support. We'll be glad to assist you in getting it right and making sure that you get the right results from your sampling. Thanks very much for your time. Goodbye.